Most people know that having too much body fat is not good for health. Even if you go past the aesthetic reasons, in other words, there's a stigma on being obese or fat in this society. A lot of people look at you as slovenly, lazy. In some cases, that's true. It's not true in other cases. In other cases, there's medical reasons that cause a tendency towards obesity. There is definitely a genetic tendency towards obesity. However, that has been played down in recent years to the point where, at one point, Gene Mayer, who was a very famous nutritionist who founded the Harvard School of Public Health and Nutrition Department, he once said that if you have one obese parent, your chances of becoming obese are 40%, and if you have two obese parents, your chances of becoming obese are 80%. However, more recent studies have looked at the genetic determinants behind obesity and have found that the genetics actually contributes something something like 1 to 2%, very little. There is a slight genetic component. What really produces obesity is, very simply, an intake of too many calories and a lack of exercise. But I don't want to talk about the causes of obesity. I want to talk about one particular type of body fat. Now, any type of body fat is associated with decreased longevity. I'll give you an example. If you look at people that live to over 100, and I've talked about this in many of my articles in Applied Metabolics and elsewhere. Look at the people that live really long time, over 100, even up to 110 or more. They tend to be very small, slight people. They're never fat, never. You never will see an obese person, excuse me. You'll never see an obese person live to over 100. Sometimes they don't even make it to 90. They're lucky if they make it to 80. Marlon Brando, I think, made it to, I think he was about 80, if I remember correctly. He was extremely obese when he died, and he died of a obesity-related complication. He died of pulmonary failure, which is definitely related to having too much body fat. Marlon liked to eat about 4 gallons a day of Haagen-Dazs ice cream and didn't exercise. Funny thing is, when he was young, he was actually pretty muscular. He loved to lift weights. He was kind of an amateur bodybuilder. I'm getting off track. I realize that. Let me get back to what I want to say. Body fat in general is bad because fat cells, known scientifically as adipocytes, for years they thought they were just inert storage of calories. In other words, they were just basically cells that stored energy. That's what fat cells were considered for many years, until it was discovered that fat cells are actually little mini endocrine organs that secrete over 100 different hormone-like substances, collectively known as adipokines. Most of these adipokines, is an important point, most of these adipokines are inflammatory. In other words, they cause inflammation, and they can cause something called systemic inflammation. Systemic inflammation is one of the main causes of many of the effects of aging. Many of the debilitating effects of aging are caused by systemic inflammation. You don't feel it. So there's another term for it called inflammaging, because a lot of people, I'd say most people, tend to get this systemic inflammation as they get older. It's related to all kinds of diseases, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, you name it. So the problem with fat cells in general is that they secrete these adipokines. And of course, the larger the fat cells and the more numerous the fat cells, the more adipokines you're going to have, the greater the degree of systemic inflammation. That being said, there's a particular type of fat that is by far the most dangerous fat. Let me explain. There's two basic kinds of fat. One type of fat is, this is the fat that bodybuilders are concerned with, subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous means just under the skin. So subcutaneous fat in a bodybuilder will obscure muscle definition. Bodybuilders go on diets to remove as much subcutaneous fat as possible. The less subcutaneous fat you have, the more muscular definition you're going to show, the more vascularity or the appearance of superficial veins. They will come out once you, if you have them. Well, everybody has them. I mean, some people have them closer to the surface than others. But what I'm saying is, when you reduce subcutaneous fat, you will definitely have more muscle definition. Now, here's the thing. Subcutaneous fat is not considered dangerous. It doesn't look good. Like I say, it obscures muscle definition. But from a health standpoint, it's not considered dangerous. Why? Because subcutaneous fat is a natural fat depot. In other words, the body has no problem storing fat under the skin. And in other words, it's considered safe. It basically stays there. It doesn't circulate. The only way to get rid of it is you burn it off through diet and exercise. But there's another type of fat that is what they call labile, meaning it's constantly being released, and for that reason, it can cause a lot of problems. This is the most dangerous type of fat. What I'm talking about is called visceral fat. As I said, it's healthy to have some body fat, but not all fats created equal. Visceral fat is a type of body fat that's stored deep in the abdominal cavity. You can't see it. It's located near several vital organs, including the liver, stomach, and intestines. Now, the problem with visceral fat is when you have a lot of it, the fat tends to overlap and wind up in organs such as the liver and other areas. This is called ectopic fat. And the fat that's stored in the liver, when the liver stores excess fat, it's not a natural depot for fat storage. So you have problems. You have what they call non-alcoholic fatty liver, which can cause all kinds of health problems. I'm not going to get into insulin. I'm sorry, insulin resistance, diabetes, heart disease. In other words, fat is safe when it's in the areas it's supposed to be, like subcutaneous. When it's in areas that it's not supposed to be, called ectopic fat, then it becomes very dangerous because, again, the release of all those inflammatory proteins that cause horrible health effects. Uh, this visceral fat can also build up in the arteries. And as I say, visceral fat, the difference between visceral fat and subcutaneous, visceral fat is much more active. It's constantly being released and sent through the portal system, a blood system in the abdomen. It's being sent to the liver, where again it tends to build up in the liver, causes fatty liver. If you have some, you might be thinking, well, I have some belly fat. I must have a lot of visceral fat. Not necessarily. Belly fat could actually be mostly subcutaneous fat. Again, fat stored just under the skin, which is not dangerous. Subcutaneous fat is also found in the arms and legs, and like I say, it's much more visible because it's near the surface. Visceral fat being deep within the abdominal cavity, you cannot see. The only way to definitively diagnose visceral fat is with a CAT scan or an MRI scan. Uh, I don't recommend you doing this because those things are very expensive. Most health insurance plans will not pay to have you have a CAT scan just to determine how much visceral fat you have. So there's other ways to do it. For example, Harvard University, they claim that about 10% of all body fat is visceral fat. So if you calculate your total body fat and then take 10% off of it, you can estimate your amount of visceral fat. Now, obviously, bodybuilders would get down to, let's say, 3% fat. Well, no, that's very uncommon. Let's say 5% fat. At 5% fat, you're absolutely shredded. You have almost very little subcutaneous fat and zero visceral fat. Don't believe the crap about 3% fat or less. 3%. A man has 3% essential body fat. Essential means that the body fat is there, for example, to hold the internal organs in place, to form the fat around neurons, the myelin sheath. Your body doesn't want to touch that 3% fat, and before it will touch that 3% fat, it's going to start burning up protein for energy and all that stuff. Uh, I'm sorry, I got to laugh. Ronnie Coleman, who I have a lot of respect for, I think he's one of the greatest bodybuilders. He recently said in an interview that he's 0.33% fat. Now, I don't know where he got this figure from. Obviously, I don't think Ronnie's lying. I think somebody just gave him some misinformation. 0.33% fat. A skeleton has more fat than that, much less a 200 or 90-pound bodybuilder like Ronnie Coleman. It's hilarious. But, I'm getting off topic again. An easy way to tell if you're at risk of visceral fat accumulation, for example, if you're a woman and your waist measures 35 inches or larger, you probably have too much visceral fat. If you're a man and your waist is larger than 40 inches, also indication of too much visceral fat. And visceral fat can start causing immediate health problems. It can cause insulin resistance, even if you've never had diabetes or pre-diabetes. Just having too much visceral fat alone can cause insulin resistance, which is a real health problem because insulin resistance can eventually lead to type 2 diabetes. Now, research has found that what causes the insulin resistance of visceral fat, even if you don't have diabetes. Well, they think it could be something called a retinol binding protein that tends to be secreted by visceral fat, and it increases insulin resistance. So, in other words, visceral fat alone, because of this retinol binding protein, can cause insulin resistance away from having any kind of diabetes. Visceral fat is also closely associated with an increase in blood pressure. The blood pressure increase in turn is associated with the increased risk for stroke. Visceral fat, again, I mentioned those inflammatory proteins secreted by normal fat cells. Well, get this, visceral fat cells secrete even more. They're much more active than normal fat cells, and they increase a number of inflammatory markers such as interleukin 6, interleukin 1b, PA-1, and tissue necrosis factor A. That last one, tissue necrosis factor A, is, by the way, one of the suspects in causing the loss of muscle with age. In other words, something called sarcopenia. When people get, let's say, past 40, a lot of them gradually start losing muscle mass with age. The medical term for it is sarcopenia, and one of the suspects is tissue necrosis factor A. Why? Because tissue necrosis factor A is a definite cause of systemic inflammation, and systemic inflammation has catabolic effects in muscle. So what am I saying here? If you're having if you have a lot of visceral fat, you probably will veer towards loss of muscle as you get past 40. Of course, if you work out and you reduce the visceral fat and you eat a good diet, which I'll get to in a minute, then you can control the tissue necrosis factor A. It no longer becomes a problem. Uh, Having excess visceral fat, as I said, it's associated with a number of very serious health problems, including heart attacks and heart disease, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, strokes, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and Alzheimer's disease. I believe there's one study came out that showing having excess visceral fat increases your risk of having Alzheimer's disease threefold, 3 times greater chance. This stuff is not a joke, folks. The good news about visceral fat is, and this is great, it's the first fat to go. When you exercise and diet, the visceral fat is the very first fat that you're going to burn off. It's very receptive to exercise, diet, and lifestyle changes. Every pound of fat you lose, some of it is visceral fat. Now, how do you get rid of visceral fat? You want to work out at least 30 minutes a day. You got to include plenty of cardio exercise and strength training. Cardio includes, of course, aerobic exercise, circuit training, biking, or running, and that burns fat faster. High-intensity interval aerobics, which actually only lasts 20 to 30 minutes, actually burns more visceral fat than steady-state aerobics, where you do just 30 minutes or 45 minutes of aerobics at a steady pace, where you don't go up and down. With high-intensity intervals, you increase the pace for like 2 minutes. You bring your heart rate up real high, like 90% of maximum, and then you slow it down for another 2 minutes down to normal, and you alternate this for about 20 to 30 minutes. That actually burns the most visceral fat of any type of aerobics. Many studies have shown that aerobic exercise can help you lose visceral fat even without dieting. Even without dieting, just doing aerobics alone. An analysis of 15 studies of 852 people compared how well different types of exercise reduce visceral fat without dieting. They found that moderate and high intensity aerobic exercise were most effective at reducing visceral fat without dieting. But on the other hand, combining aerobic exercise with a healthy diet is more effective at targeting visceral fat than either one alone. Now, another thing to consider is stress. What happens when you're under a lot of stress? You secrete too much of the adrenal steroid cortisol. Cortisol increases visceral fat because cortisol tends to cause increased fat deposition in the torso and the visceral fat area. So the more stress you're under, the more cortisol you secrete, the greater degree of visceral fat. So you want to do things like meditation and stress management techniques to lower your cortisol level. You can take some supplements, phosphatidylserine, taken in a dose of about 300 to 400 milligrams a day, will also help lower cortisol. You want to make sure you get enough sleep. That also helps lower cortisol. As far as diets go, by far the best diet to lower visceral fat rapidly are low carb diets. In fact, many studies have shown that low carb diets are more effective at reducing visceral fat than low fat diets. In other words, low carb diets beat low fat diets for reducing this most dangerous type of fat, visceral fat. In an 8-week study published in the journal Obesity in 2013 that included 69 overweight men and women, scientists found that people who followed a low carb diet lost 10% more visceral fat and 4.4% more total fat than those on a low fat diet. I mean, no matter what you read of these so-called anti-low carb people, there's no question low carb diets produce greater fat loss. And the fact that they produce greater visceral fat loss means that they're healthier diets for reducing body fat than low fat, high carb diets. I don't care what any of these so-called experts say. They're full of crap. And, don't get me going on that. And additionally, the ketogenic diet, which is also a low-carb diet, may also help reduce visceral fat. A study including 28 overweight and obese adults found that those who followed a ketogenic diet lost more fat, especially visceral fat, than people following a low-fat diet. Here we go again. And get this, they did so while eating 300 more calories a day on the ketogenic diet than they ate on the low-fat diet, and they still lost more visceral fat. You know? So also another way to reduce visceral fat is increase your protein intake and increase your fiber intake. Soluble fiber in particular, such as found in oatmeal and fruits and vegetables, is really good for helping to reduce visceral fat, helps give you a feeling of fullness so you eat less calories. You also want to limit alcohol intake. We've all heard of the famous term beer belly? Well, that belly is, believe it or not, a lot of it's visceral fat, because the type of fat you get from drinking too much alcohol happens to be visceral fat, which is really bad. That's one of the reasons, besides its effect on the liver and the brain, that's why drinking too much alcohol is really, really bad for your heart. You want to avoid trans fats. Trans fats are basically hydrogenated fats. They're kind of like being eliminated. The FDA wanted them to completely out of foods by the year 2018. So trans fats are largely gone. They're usually found in processed foods. However, they still sneak into some foods like peanut butter. Some of the peanut butter that's not the natural peanut butter, which is 100% peanuts, but some of the other peanut butter, you'll notice it says 0 trans fats. And then if you look on the label, it says contains less than 0.5% trans fat, but that's related to 1 tablespoon. As soon as you eat like 3 tablespoons, now you're getting too much trans fats. So trans fats still are around, and you want to avoid them. One 6-year study of monkeys who were fed either a diet rich in trans fat or monounsaturated fat, such as found in virgin olive oil and macadamia nuts, monkeys on the trans fat diet gained 33% more visceral fat despite taking in the same number of calories. That's how bad oh God. Studies have shown that a lack of sleep may increase your risk of visceral fat, as I said earlier. Conversely, increasing your sleep may reduce visceral fat. A 6-year study including 293 people found that increasing sleep from 6 hours or less to 7 to 8 hours reduced visceral fat gain by roughly 26%. Just getting enough sleep, 7 to 8 hours a night, will reduce your visceral fat by 26%. So you make sure you get that sleep. I have other videos telling you how to do that. If you have sleep apnea, which is a condition where you stop breathing while you're sleeping, that unfortunately also is associated with increased risk of gaining visceral fat, again because of the interference with sleep. And one other suggestion I give, intermittent fasting, which I've talked about in other videos. It's another good way to help reduce visceral fat. A review of studies found that following an intermittent fasting style of eating helped reduce visceral fat by 4 to 7% over a period of 6 to 24 weeks. So that's about it about visceral fat. I am going to have an article in my Applied Metabolics News that are talking about the science of body fat, where I will have a lot more information on visceral fat and subcutaneous fat, its effects on health, and a lot of things in that article that a lot of people don't know, including people that think they're well educated. They're going to be in for a big surprise when it comes to knowledge of body fat science. It's all going to be in my Applied Metabolics. If you want more information on nutrition, exercise science, anti-aging research that you can use today, fat loss techniques that really work, including ways to reduce visceral fat, hormonal therapy, ergogenic aids, women's health and fitness, supplement science, and much more. Subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. 40 to 50 pages every month, no ads, no BS. I'm not trying to push any products on you. I'm not associated with any supplement company like other people. I'm not going to try and sell you anything other than the information in the newsletter, which is solid, evidence-based, and if it is opinion or conjecture, I label it such. I'm not going to lead anyone on. It's a 100% true. Believe me, I'm one of the last bastions on the internet. And I said bastion, not bastard. I'm one of the last bastions on the internet of total truth. I give you the 100% truth. I have a reputation for integrity, and I intend to keep that. So to subscribe today. When you subscribe, I'll send you an invitation to join my private Applied Metabolics Facebook page, where every day I post new information on medicine, nutrition, exercise, and general health, only for subscribers of my Applied Metabolics newsletter. I do have an email portal on my Applied Metabolics website, exclusively for current subscribers only. I don't answer unsolicited questions. However, you're welcome to answer questions under in the comment section under this video. I cannot guarantee I will answer them. Some other people may answer them, but I always answer questions submitted to me by current subscribers. I'm also open to accepting requests for future video topics, as long as it interests a wider range of people. Like this topic I talked about today, visceral fat. I mean, that affects something like, 266 million Americans. So I would say there's a wide range of interest in that. You know what I mean? On the other hand, I think you could count on my fingers of one hand, the number of people that are interested in urine therapy or something like that. So I'm not going to be talking about that stuff. However, I could recommend if you're really interested in learning the basis of urine therapy, I recommend a book available on Amazon called it's called Urine Therapy by IP Daily. Anyway, sorry, I had to slip that in. Anyway, so that's about it. If you want to have the best friend you ever have, go to your local shelter and adopt a dog. Take care. I'm sorry, the name of the book is called Yellow Streams by IP Daily.